Welcome to this panel discussion on hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is a topic which is being discussed in the course on epistemology. We have several courses in the BA and MA programs of study, and one of the most important course is epistemology, which is basically theory of knowledge. In our panel discussion today, we have two experts. One is Professor Keith D'Souza, who is a professor of philosophy. He has a PhD from Marquette University in USA. His PhD is in hermeneutics. I am also pleased to introduce Professor Ivo Coelho, who is also an expert on hermeneutics. He has a PhD in philosophy, again on the same subject of hermeneutics, Gregorian University in Rome. Now, to begin with, I would like Professor Keith D'Souza to define and describe this technical word hermeneutics.
As you rightly say, it is a technical word, hermeneutics. It comes from a Greek word, hermenoin. Hermenoin itself comes from the word Hermes. Now, Hermes was the name of a Greek god, and the responsibility of that Greek god was to translate or to make understandable the language of the gods to human beings, because the language of the gods is very dense, very opaque, very difficult to understand. That is why even today, if you have a sacred text, you want an expert, a pandit or a scholar to interpret, to break the meaning of that text. Now, what is the definition, a simple definition of hermeneutics? It is the theory of interpretation. Simple definition, the theory of interpretation. If you want to make it more specific, the theory of the interpretation of texts, because hermeneutics deals with texts in a very narrow, specific sense. Now, if you want a more technical definition, it is a study of the operations of the understanding as they are applied to the interpretation of texts. We use the operations of understanding for different things. Suppose a historian is looking at the past, he is understanding the past and also therefore creating a text from that past based on his or her understanding. A scientist is looking at reality, different aspects of reality, and is using understanding to analyze reality, to process reality, to come out with theories about reality. So, when understanding or the operations, what goes on in our mind when we understand, when it is being used to look at text specifically, narrow sense, then that hermeneutics is involved. In a broad sense, you can expand hermeneutics to include any aspect of reality that can be looked upon like a text. Now, what are the aspects of reality that can be looked upon like a text? Your body, for example. Suppose I am looking at you right now, Professor Thomas. You seem to be a very relaxed man, you seem to be an honest man. I am making an interpretation. Right. If I am meeting you for the first time, and if I don't know you, still we do make interpretations. We say, I like this person, I don't like this person. We are making. When we are judging human action, that can be made into a text. And if you look at psychology, sociology, anthropology, these are human sciences, social sciences, the softer sciences, which are making judgments about human actions, about human behavior. So in some sense, hermeneutics, in a narrow sense, it is used for the interpretation of texts. In a broad sense, it is used for the interpretation of any aspect of reality that can be considered to be a text. So that is what hermeneutics is, the theory of the interpretation of texts.
Thank you. Professor Ivo Coelho, you are a professor in Divyadan in Nasik, and you are teaching students of philosophy. Now, we are living in a fast changing society with a lot of social changes taking place, and along with that, lot of new issues are coming up, which is also forcing university students, even school education also is facing a kind of a challenge in introducing new topics into the curriculum. And given that kind of a scenario where we have plenty to be taught, what is the importance of or why should somebody take the pain of learning hermeneutics?
Yeah, it's a good question, Professor Thomas. Why add one more course to an already crowded syllabus? But the fact is that all through life, as Professor D'Souza has already begun saying, in almost all aspects of life we have to interpret. We are actually interpreting. I think hermeneutics only points our attention to something that is already happening, and perhaps it is making us aware of our own contribution to understanding what seems to be just bare plain fact. Let us say, when I see a person here in the city of Delhi, I immediately ask myself, is this person a North Indian, is this person a South Indian? And if I am a South Indian, I will understand a North Indian in one particular way. What am I doing there? I am reading person through a certain prejudice, a certain bias, or a certain understanding that I already have beforehand. I am interpreting that reality which I see. Or take something very simple like physical gestures. A Westerner, an Italian for example, when he meets or she meets another person, they will immediately give a warm embrace. There is physical contact. But if a person like that comes to India and tries to do the same thing, that gesture may be misinterpreted as over familiarity.
Yeah.
So there is here again a question of a reality that is being seen differently, interpreted differently. So I mean, there are other very common examples like religion, for example. We may both be speaking English, we may both be using the word God, but can I assume that when I say God, I mean the same thing as when you say God? There is a gap there, and hermeneutics is the discipline that points out to that gap and makes us alert before presuming that we understand another person.
Well, Professor D'Souza, would you like to add on to what Professor Coyle has explained to us about
I can give some very simple examples. If you, as I all go to a doctor, the doctor interprets and judges what is wrong. Sometimes we are may not be happy with that interpretation, with that opinion, and especially if it is a serious disease like cancer. And then we say, let us take a second opinion. So what are we doing? We are actually going from one interpretation to the other, and finally we will have to take a judgment about what course of action to take. And I've already mentioned about history, how history is an interpretation of the past, and sometimes there are tricky questions that can be raised about that. Am I free to interpret the past, or am I accountable to a larger community when I interpret the past? There are very serious epistemological questions. Hermeneutics is different from epistemology in this sense. Epistemology deals with truth, what is true. Hermeneutics deals with meaning, what is meaningful. And there is a difference between these two disciplines. Even though epistemology would like to swallow up and embrace hermeneutics, hermeneutics would like to keep its distance and say that at the level of meaning, one interpretation may be different from the other, and yet both may be meaningful.
Okay. So basically hermeneutics means it is interpretation of text. If so, Professor Coyle, can you tell us what kind of or types of or categories of text which needs more interpretation, the kind of text that you would consider?
Yes, I think there are texts that need little or no interpretation, and there are texts that need a lot of interpretation. Take for example a text of mathematics. If I am not familiar with mathematics, that text might not mean anything to me, but it is not really a matter of interpretation according to me. It is a matter of learning the concepts that are necessary, the theorems that are necessary, so that I might be able to understand that text. Or let's say a text also of physical science. There again, some people will understand that text, some people will not, but it depends more on their background knowledge, on their ability to read that text. The scientific and mathematical texts, they tend to have a single meaning. In fact, we would say it is an attributed meaning, a constructed meaning, and that meaning, since we have given that meaning to it, it remains, it can be assumed to be universal. The problem is there are many other areas of life which have meanings which vary with culture, with time and with place. That is when the problem of interpretation comes in a major way. What would those areas be? Traditionally, I think one major area has been religion. So religious texts have probably been at the root of this whole art of interpretation, because they have given rise to many meanings, and there have been texts which are difficult to understand, that need to be therefore explained well. Another area is law, and law is a slightly different area. There may be a legal system and the laws may be very clear, and yet that law has to be interpreted, applied to a particular situation, which is what a court of law is doing. The lawyers, the judge ultimately has the task of arriving at an application of a particular law or set of laws to a concrete situation. So that is another big area of interpretation. And a third area traditionally is the whole area of literature. And I would add also art. But let's stick to literature, prose, poetry, or whatever it may be. There, of course, you have varieties of meanings that we can derive. And perhaps here, the theory that there are as many meanings as interpreters probably is most valid. A work of art reveals itself anew and differently each time somebody looks at it or someone different looks at it. So I would say these were the three major areas in which interpretation played a large role.
Now, if so, how did this concept of hermeneutics develop as a field of study? What is its history?
Yeah, as I was saying, probably the problem started with the religious texts. Okay. In India, we have the Astika darshanas, the darshanas that believe in God and in the established texts. We have the Nastik darshanas like Buddhism and Jainism. I think both these major areas had problems of text interpretation. Just to remain with the Astik darshanas themselves, we have the great school of the Purva Mimamsa. Mimamsa means interpretation, and they took the Vedic texts basically and they tried to find out what they meant. But they had one focus, assumption perhaps, and that is that the texts were meant to guide ritual action. And they had that focus, and according to that they built up their system of interpretation. The Uttara Mimamsa, the Mimamsa that came after the school, is more popularly known as Vedanta. That had quite a different focus. Shankaracharya, for example, would say the primary purpose of the Vedas and the Vedanta is to teach the way to liberation. And so he gave focus or consideration not to the ritual texts, but to the texts that spoke about Brahman, the great sentences, the Mahavakyas. So that is again an option that he made, and according to that he developed his theory of interpretation. In the West, I would say also maybe the history of interpretation started because of religious texts. In all religion we have